welcome to our speakers. And first of all, we're going to have a double act by Andrew McClelland, Roisin, Jordan, I got her name right. They're both from the University of Manchester. They're both doing research there, and they're both working for the National Consortium for Society Resilience. So I'll hand straight over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see such a fantastic attendance, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to speak to conference today. So our first slide, as was just mentioned, not only do we have to negotiate the clicker, but we're also a double act. So hopefully our transitions between the different parts of our presentations will go smoothly. As was mentioned, so my name is Andrew McClelland, and I'm a research associate at the University of Manchester, based at the Alliance Manchester Business School. But a lot of my work over the last year and more has been in relation to the National Consortium for Societal Resilience. I think many of you will be familiar with the NCSR and the work, perhaps taking part or listening in to the various webinars that we've obviously organised over that period, and perhaps also familiar with the strategy and manual that we've produced in relation to developing a local resilience capability. So apologies up front in terms of that familiarity, that we will be perhaps treading over some old ground, but obviously we'll also be introducing some new aspects to the kind of work that we've been doing. So that's enough from me at this point, and I'll pass over to Roisin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roisin, and I'm a postgraduate researcher at the University of Manchester. So my research aligns closely with the ongoing work of NCSR. So I work really closely with Andrew and the wider university team, as well as members and partners of NCSR. So today, Andrew and I are going to take you through a little bit of a journey, so an introduction and a background to NCSR. We will talk about the strategy and manual, so a key resource that has been developed and launched recently, just last month, via a webinar that you may have joined. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about a piece of work that forms part of my research, but has also involved members of the team. And that is a review that has specifically looked at the role of essential businesses in societal resilience. So I'm going to hand back over to Andrew, who's going to talk a little bit about our wider team and our approach.
It's obviously been mentioned already several times today in terms of a lot of the context to the resilience framework and the ongoing activities, but similar. Us coming together as a team in terms of the University of Manchester context, but then, of course, the emergence over the last number of years of the NCSR is very, very much in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So both Roisin and I, we joined a research project at the University of Manchester based on around the recovery, renewal, resilience in the context of particularly local government and the COVID-19 pandemic. This was an Economic and Social Research Council funded project over a 2-year period, and we came together as part of the University of Manchester team led by Professor Duncan Shaw, but also including colleagues like David Powell, who very much comes from a practitioner background, but is also linked into the university context, and then various other members of that team within the Alliance Manchester Business School, the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at the university, and also then other kind of wider partners. So it was very much in this context of COVID that our team came together, that we were working in this kind of interdisciplinary way, looking at the various response, recovery, renewal, resilience challenges in relation to the pandemic. And this was very much an action research project. So it was a project that wasn't just about grand theorizing, albeit we have obviously been trying to develop our kind of theoretical and conceptual work in relation to the outworkings of that project. But it was very much embedded then in a practice setting. And there was lots of kind of ongoing engagement during the course of the pandemic that Duncan, that David, that other members within the team had in the practice setting, including LRFs. And many of you in the room obviously may be familiar with Duncan and David and that kind of ongoing work that they were doing in various LRF settings in particular, trying to give kind of expert advice on issues around recovery and best practice that was emerging internationally. Some of my work in that context was particularly internationally focused, so we were trying to draw these kind of lessons. But Roisin will then talk about then some of the activities during the project before we move on to the consortium.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so as Andrew talked about, the Recovery, Renewal, Resilience project was kind of extensively engaged in organisations and local resilience partnerships, both in the UK but also internationally. So you can see here on the infographic, we've got some of our international partners here from New Zealand, Chile, Palestine, USA, Canada, Scotland, and England. And in terms of what the kind of project developed, the project team was comprised of a range of academics from multiple disciplines, and the project developed an international standard on recovery and renewal. We also ran over 100 webinars, and some of you may be familiar with the Manchester briefing. So in terms of my role on the recovery project, I primarily worked on the Manchester briefing, and I know that the Emergency Planning Society were fantastic partners throughout the Manchester briefing, and would share it widely and often. In terms of the webinars and the Manchester briefing, so they are kind of two vehicles of both how we bring in international insight and lessons, but also share ongoing work, from the ongoing work of the NCSR, and lessons and outputs from that. So both of those kind of vehicles have been retained in our current work. So we've got ongoing webinars, and the Manchester briefing has been adapted to the National Briefing on Societal Resilience. And so recently we shared the strategy and manual via the National Briefing. So this research practice collaboration that Andrew talked about really was cemented through the Recovery, Renewal, Resilience project, and has been carried through to the approach taken through the national consortium. And I know that Andrew's now going to talk a little bit about the partners and collaborators of NCSR.
So I guess one of the things we're trying to emphasize is this kind of criticality in terms of the work of the NCSR, in terms of our work at Manchester. Clearly, in that we bring that sort of research, sort of academic background, is that this is very much a collaborative space. Clearly, we come from that kind of research and academic perspective. We have certain skills around facilitation, obviously academic rigor in relation to the kind of work that we do. But it's also then this engaging with this wider set of partners from multiple sectors that has really been very valuable. So the National Consortium itself is obviously co-chaired. Duncan Shaw, our boss within the university, is one of the co-chairs, but obviously there are then several co-chairs from LRFs in Sussex and Suffolk. And obviously Suffolk has already been mentioned today in relation to the Stronger LRF programme. So it's really this sort of collaborative space that's been extremely valuable to the work of the NCSR as we kind of try to take forward then some of the lessons identified in relation to the COVID pandemic, but we take that forward then in this kind of emerging policy context around resilience. I won't go through all of the different partners here. You can obviously see, many of the, or most of the LRFs in terms of England, but also then emergency preparedness groups and other resilience partnerships throughout the UK plus, including Jersey and Guernsey. We obviously have VCSEP and other partner organisations in the context of the voluntary sector. We have obviously business representative groups. We have obviously the government sector, and then ourselves in terms of the University of Manchester, trying to then bring that together. So it's really been a very interesting sort of collaborative space that has emerged from the pandemic times, and that obviously we've tried to then carry forward in terms of our ongoing engagement around whole of society and societal resilience. And I think also related to that COVID context, clearly, and this kind of early origin story, if you like, in relation to the NCSR, has clearly been this emerging policy landscape. So it not only kind of provided that early impetus, around 21, 22, in terms of the review, which mentioned whole of society resilience, but then that taken forward in the resilience framework, I think has been critical to give an early focus and an impetus to that early work. And I think particularly around, obviously there have already been several quotations from the resilience framework, but this particular quotation, obviously, that we have sought to draw out in relation to whole of society resilience, and trying to then position this in terms of a national endeavour around whole of society resilience, and then thinking through in terms of what we could do in the NCSR context, what we could do to try to ground and localise that kind of national endeavour around whole of society resilience. I won't read out this quotation, but clearly, as academics also, we were then trying to think through, okay, well, what does this mean? Where do we start? How do we approach this? And clearly that was also something that many of the resilience partnerships and others engaged in the work of the NCSR were also asking. And I think that kind of early impetus then was about trying to make that real, and try to produce something that could lead to the operationalising of whole of society resilience then in this kind of more localised setting. So I'll pass on to Roisin.
Thanks, Andrew. So just to pick up on thinking about the framing of resilience through a whole of society approach, it certainly provides the aspirational dimension. It's wholly inclusive in its nature, and to pick up on something Paul said earlier, when we think about progressing work towards enhancing societal resilience, we cannot leave parts of society behind. And when thinking about who should be involved in societal resilience, it encourages a much broader range of actors that perhaps previously may not have had as prominent or as an active role in resilience. But instead of thinking about societal resilience as an equal focus, all at once, recognizing that society is broad, diverse, when really starting to think about some of those key considerations when thinking about translating and operationalizing this, like differing starting points, different priorities, limited resource, critical issues around risk and vulnerability, recognizing that many parts of society are resilient, and we have learned, many lessons, particularly, maybe over the last couple of years in relation to COVID and others, realizing that society, has resilience and can be activated, and there is a willingness and a motivation to both help themselves and help others, perhaps in their locality or within their networks. With that, then, thinking and recognizing a need for guidance and recognizing a need for a proportionate approach. An approach that outlines realistic expectations, ambition, scope, and something that integrates within existing local resilience structures. So NCSR began to think about and work to develop a strategy and manual to operationalize societal resilience as a capability. And one that delivers functions to society that helps them to prepare, respond and recover to disruptions. Very much kind of prioritizing need, prioritizing services that meet need and support parts of society, and the organizations as well that provide those services. So Andrew, I'm going to hand back to you.
So I'll just bring this all up onto the screen. So this is really, this particular slide is really showing the journey. As I've mentioned, the NCSR context has really been about this kind of co-production, this kind of interface and exchange and knowledge exchange between, say, academics and those engaged in practice across the UK+. And we've kind of embarked on this journey in terms of the production of, I guess, one of the core resources that the consortium has produced to date in relation to the strategy and manual to create a local resilience capability. And we really started early on, so it's taken approximately 18 months of work from the very beginning then to the launch of the strategy, as Roisin said earlier, in September via webinar. And that strategy is obviously freely available for people. If you haven't gotten hold of it already, we can obviously provide you with a link later. So we've started with various kind of research type things, but also discussion groups. So baseline survey, webinars and case studies, and various other kind of bits and pieces of research and work and co-productive work that we've done. We've then taken it through various different stages in terms of drafting of the document. We've held very focused discussion groups, say focusing on particular aspects, particularly around terminology used, and we've obviously then made adjustments in relation to the emerging strategy as we went along, based on the kind of discussions that we had within these settings and within these different webinar settings. We've also then opened it out to the wider consortium, obviously, for periods of kind of consultation and feedback. We had a two-day training event in Manchester at the beginning of July, and obviously Paul was there, and Sonia was able to speak to us. That was a fantastic 2 days that we also learned, and that also gave us an opportunity then to filter back in and to refine the document itself. And as I said, we ended up with then the finalised strategy in September. And I say finalised in that we will continue a kind of a refinement process with the implementation work that's going to be ongoing. So it's still a watch this space, but obviously we have a defined product at this point in time. I won't go through this in detail because obviously we have limited time. It's really just to draw out some of the key principles in relation to the strategy and manual before then obviously getting to some of the focal points that Roisin's going to have in relation to essential businesses. I guess key things to reference in terms of underpinnings of the strategy and manual is that we're really very much looking at it as a strategic capability. As we've already heard, resilience requires strategy. It's bigger than simply response, and perhaps we see in the government resilience framework that there has perhaps been a shift then in emphasis from resilience to response, and obviously then we need to roll in behind that in terms of what we do in our local contexts. So then clearly it involves a broader range of partners. It's not just an EPO function, but there needs to be others engaged within this process, whilst EPO functions and others are clearly then still core in terms of integration mechanisms, but we do need to engage this wider set of partners. We're very much focused on priority groups, as Roisin mentioned, so particularly prioritising the needs of the most vulnerable persons in society. It's also recognising, obviously, that many people are already resilient, and perhaps all they need in the context of a disruption is information, but they're able to self-help, and not only that, they can also help others. But we need some kind of mechanism to try to activate that as well. How do we coordinate the kind of help that they might be able to provide in the context of a disruption? We're still suggesting, obviously, then you're starting with risk and vulnerability, so local risk registers, for example. But then another key aspect in relation to keeping it in proportion, recognising that we don't want to create a whole range of new structures, recognising that resources are limited, but we have to start somewhere, and we start simple, and we try to grow it from there. So it doesn't need to be huge, and it's not just volunteers, but we can focus on a particular risk, a particular place, or some other aspect that keeps it real and keeps it limited, but is something that then can be scaled up. Again, I won't go into too much detail around this, but this is, I guess, one of the core aspects of the strategy and manual. And this is a kind of, a process diagram that kind of represents what we suggest are the 8 steps that are needed to create a local resilience capability. So clearly you can see how it's segmented in relation to ambition, design, implementation, and then a continuous evaluation kind of process. And I guess in terms of that production timeline over that period of 18 months, initially we started with 6 steps, but that then has expanded based on the learning and based on the feedback that we've had. Some of the learning coming from existing implementation cases, particularly South Yorkshire, LRF, and particularly Greater Manchester, because I guess in terms of their time frame, they are the most progressed. But we've obviously been engaging with others and will be engaging with others in the next number of months. So we've added the first step in terms of ambition, because we actually saw that was actually really crucial to the starting point, making sure that partners are aligned, making sure that they're aligned around this ambition early on. And of course, that's easy to say that's easy to write on the page, but it's really very difficult sometimes to bring together. We heard about some of the challenges earlier. For example, one of the LRF's areas having, say, 14 local authorities. Each of the LRFs obviously being very different in terms of the coterminosity of the different footprints of the different partner organizations. So clearly there are lots of challenges around this first step, which may take time, but we're then suggesting that some of the other steps can possibly roll in much quicker, at least in the design phase. When we're coming, say, to implementation, we're very much talking about, under step 5, we're very much talking about instrumental partnerships. So because we're trying to emphasize trying to meet the needs of the most vulnerable within society, then we need to have very strategic partnerships at the local level that are kind of speaking to that need, that are able to address the various groups that perhaps in the past haven't been addressed. So there may be the need for new partners, and there may be the need to kind of reframe existing partnerships to make sure that they're effective and that they are instrumental to generating and creating and delivering this capability. And clearly, we also need to show that we're delivering value to society. I think that's going to be critical in terms of the future work of the NCSR through the implementation. So several of the cases that we've been working with have kind of gotten to the implementation stage. So in terms of future refinements of the strategy and manual, clearly we'll be learning from that implementation stage as they progress, and then we can feed that learning back into future iterations of the strategy and manual. I think that's going to be critical, and that's really part of this kind of co-development process. And I think that's where we come in terms of our strengths from the university research setting. And now I'll move on to Roisin, or hand back to Roisin, who will talk more about then the essential businesses and particular research in terms of your PhD.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so when thinking about operationalizing societal resilience as a local resilience capability, it's about understanding need. And all of the parts of society, so whether that include the needs of individuals, groups of type or place, organizations that provide essential services, or networks, all of those parts of society that the resilience framework talks about, and where their needs may, for example, be due to exposure to risk, vulnerability, an inability to prepare, a lack of awareness, or a lack of agency to leverage their knowledge and self-determine future resilience. When thinking about the coordination and the corresponding support then, it's also about recognizing that all of these parts of society are part of the solution and can be part of the solution. And there's kind of, considerable scope for further integration of the efforts of wider society within local resilience structures in terms of identifying and understanding need and aligning support. So within the strategy and manual, there are a number of modules. So there's 5 listed here. Now, this isn't intended to be an exhaustive list, but begins to kind of think about the kinds of activities that contribute to the capability. So the first module here, community hubs. So community hubs will form a focus of work over the next 12 months, thinking about developing a community hub principle, a community hub design that can support the needs of individuals, groups, organizations, and networks. Another module then is focused around maintaining essential services. So those essential services that society and particularly vulnerable people rely on, thinking about the impacts of disruption on their continuity, the knock-on effects of this on vulnerable groups, for example, creation of unmet or new need, or exacerbating vulnerability. So we just wanted to share as well and a couple of kind of key highlights from a report that was carried out by Judy Scully and Duncan Shaw in collaboration with the National Preparedness Commission. And within this report, there are 14 case studies, the majority of which all worked with local essential businesses and wider businesses locally as well. And some of the kind of key lessons that came from that were, local businesses were able to contribute a range of resources, and these were really, kind of taken advantage of, for example, through particularly those who had long-standing and established relationships. Many of the case studies within this report were built upon existing structures and existing relationships, were adapted, for example, to the particular impacts and needs that came about due to COVID. But many of whom were also entirely new mutual aid ventures. And a couple of, I suppose, the key lessons from that were the considerable scope that there is to further integrate local essential services into resilient structures and local resilient systems. And this kind of brings me nicely on to talking about a part of my research specifically. And I mentioned that this piece of work is a review of academic research and policy. And this piece of work had two aims. One was to understand how policy and academic research were first defining and describing a whole of society approach. What was that meant to mean? And also with a focus on the positioning of essential businesses within this approach and how that was being described, how that was being defined, and also trying to identify how that was changing and how that was evolving. A particularly notable kind of early finding was the difference in pace at which policy is referring to this whole of society approach. And the need to broaden out the range of actors that are involved and the way that we work across society to mobilize and collaborate and I suppose bring together collective resources and capabilities. Across both, there was, on that point, in terms of academic research, you could say it's very much catching up on the whole of society approach. It is increasing and it is growing, but there's a considerable difference in terms of the pace at which I suppose kind of reinforces the importance of really looking at this and trying to bring both of those, areas together to really make sense, to begin to make sense of all of this. In terms of in terms of research and policy, there was a broad consensus across both in terms of recognizing that in the past there has been a lesser focus on the role of essential businesses within this conversation. Often at times, businesses in general, but also essential businesses and for example, community resilience have slightly been treated in isolation and separately rather than really understanding how they both interact and depend on each other. So this paper is in later stages of peer review. So briefly over the next couple of slides, I'm going to just give a bit of an overview of the key findings of this review and some of the implications that may be of relevance as well. So the review found that the role of essential businesses is threefold. The first, essential businesses are integral to the strategic partnerships that can operationalize societal resilience. Essential businesses can contribute capacity and resource. In particular, essential businesses have, considerable knowledge and insight on and abilities to identify risk and vulnerability and provide support, for example, direct support to customers. But also the wider communities that they operate within and that they serve or provide for. Second, essential businesses benefit from spillovers of essential or of societal resilience. Essential businesses as organizations are impact and are impacted by external contingencies. And very much the review found that there is a need to really deepen our understanding of how these external factors like societal systems, relationships and networks impact organizational resilience and their continuity and what this means and how this then, again, like I mentioned earlier, kind of has this knock-on effect on wider society. In terms of essential businesses, there is so much to learn from wider partners, from collaborating with public sector, with voluntary and community sector. A recurring example that is within policy and research is particularly around exercising and testing, taking lessons from those practices and processes and implementing them. Much of the policy and research here particularly highlights firm characteristics that will have an impact, for example, on what contributions essential businesses can make depending on what their size is or their resource. And that is also maybe where some organisations can also benefit from further support from local resilience partnerships in relation to considering and adopting business continuity, for example, and how that might be done, and other information and awareness from wider partners. And finally, then, essential businesses contribute to risk. Organisations have a responsibility. So, for example, responsible management of natural resources. So the resources that these organisations rely on to produce essential services, and therefore then that society, almost in a secondary way, relies on these businesses and organisations to responsibly manage these natural resources in a way that ensures sustainability and long-term provision. So we just hear, I realize so this slide simply just highlights some of the key implications as operators of critical infrastructure and providers of essential services. Essential businesses have a crucial leadership role in societal resilience. A clear delineation of responsibility encourages ownership and accountability. The literature and policy talk about an appropriate cascade of support with this responsibility so that businesses and wider actors have the agency to mobilise resource. Much of this, for example, might be regulatory, but it also could be through guidance and frameworks, for example, around risk management, assurance, accountability, managing cross-sector partnerships and the governance of those. Maintaining continuity of essential businesses should be prioritised as a disruption from the perspective of meeting immediate and urgent needs in society. And then finally, a better understanding of resilience needs and potentially challenging how we define essential businesses, really digging into what, at the hyper-local level, who delivers what essential services to who, and really kind of challenging our thinking around that. So more than happy to expand on these through questions, but I'll just hand over to Andrew to finish up. Thanks.
So this is just a wrap-up slide, I guess. That was a neat way of showing that research that Roisin's obviously just talked about is undergoing peer review. So then a task will be to then translate that back into the practice environment. But clearly, in terms of the work of the strategy and manual, there's ongoing implementation cases. We'll be starting some work with Cleveland and Merseyside and others in the coming months. So clearly then we will be trying to then translate that ongoing effort from the practitioner level, then bring that into the space of the strategy and manual in terms of new iterations. And I guess in terms of our academic hats, at some point we will then translate that back into theory and concepts. So we're trying to do that kind of two-way process. I won't talk about anything else at this point because I think we've overrun, but obviously happy to engage with anyone during the various breaks, and obviously to provide any links to some of the documents that we've referenced. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Roisin. We've asked our speakers to pack an awful lot into the time available.